And welcome to Atheists Talk. My name is James Zimmerman, and for today's episode, we are going to be talking with local author Richard Mouse. Richard is joining us here in the studio today. He's an author now, but he's had quite a career. He went to Catholic parochial school as a young man, so of course he became a skeptic pretty early on too. He's had a long career as a teacher, over 30 years. He also had time owning a small computer business. And in 2006, he wrote this book, The Lucky One, Making It Past Polio and Despair. But today we're going to talk to him primarily about his book, Faith Enterprise, Making Mysteries and Miracles Vanish. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you.
So the first thing I want to ask you about is kind of what I just kind of stole your thunder there, is I want to talk about when and how you became a skeptic, someone who was raised in a Catholic environment.
Well, if I could take a couple minutes. When I was in both of these books that you just mentioned, I talked about the trauma of finding out about Santa Claus. I cried when I asked my dad. I had heard in school that there was no Santa Claus, and that night at home I asked my dad about that, and he admitted that, yeah, there's no Santa Claus. I bawled. I just couldn't take it. I couldn't understand how I could have believed something so seriously that was false. And he, of course, assured me that we're still going to have Christmas, we're still going to have toys, we're still going to keep it a secret, because I had a younger sister and a younger brother, and I got past that. And the next summer, that was about it at that time. Then the next summer, I tried to catch a live rabbit, and spent some time every week all summer trying to catch this live rabbit. One time I caught it in a box and it got out again. And again, I didn't associate that with anything religious, but in about the second grade, this teacher spent a lot of time talking about Noah's Ark. And the teacher handed out a little holy card to everybody showing ark up on a hill with the sun shining on it, and all these animals 2 by 2 lined up to go on the ark. And I looked at that as a farm boy and thought, it doesn't quite work that way. I saw my dad and a truck driver try to load cattle onto a truck or a hog onto a truck, and they don't want to do that. It's a battle to get them on the truck. So to see these, so all of a sudden I started thinking that maybe this is a story like Santa Claus. Somebody made it up. This might not be a real story. And I had already heard of other childhood stories, everything from Cinderella and Robin Hood, and I knew that there were made up stories floating around. And I thought, maybe this is another one of those, but the adults seem to be taking it pretty seriously. So I decided at that point, I've got to pay close attention to see if I can hear any story that can verify that all this religious stuff is true, or show that it's not true. I became the skeptic at that point.
So you weren't necessarily rejecting everything.
I wasn't rejecting it. Oh no, I was in a very Catholic environment. I had 4 aunts that were nuns, 4 cousins that were priests. I was all Catholic, but I thought, I gotta pay close attention, because on that Santa Claus story, I should have known that reindeer don't fly. So if I can watch for something like that again, I could find out if it's real or not. So that's when I became a skeptic.
So how about now as an adult? I'm pretty sure it's safe to say you don't consider yourself a Catholic. Do you identify as an atheist, or?
I identify myself as an atheist. I already, my whole career, my education was in science and math. I majored in math and physics in college and taught math and physics in high schools along with computers. So I'm steeped into the world of science, but I also had 14 years of the Catholic exposure, so those worlds are kind of in conflict in a lot of areas. And I think that's what ultimately, and I just stopped going to church when I was young, but as I got to retirement and finished this first book, then I thought, you know, a nice job would be to try to see if I can document my feelings about what what was a myth and what was a scam and what was true and what wasn't. And that led to this second book.
So in that second book, Faith Enterprise, I feel like your background your strong religious background as a young man and then your strong science background as a slightly older man gave you the ability to really elucidate the difference between science and faith. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Sure. It's really quite simple because faith, the definition, if you look in the dictionary, the definition of faith says faith is believing something without evidence. And of course, some people, the religious people, they think if they have strong faith or deep faith that that's better, but it's all the same. It's believing something with no evidence. Science, on the other hand, only depends on evidence, only builds on evidence. And the theories they build up have to fit together, or they just simply study it more, or try to get more evidence, or literally throw it out. Science depends on evidence. Mm-hmm. And so they're opposites. And I wrote in one part of the book here that every accident is an instance of the conflict between faith and science. If you believe something, whether it's doing something with boiling water on a stove or driving your car on an icy road or anything, if you believe something and it turns out that reality intervenes and you have an accident, all that means is you didn't look at the evidence close enough, or you weren't aware of it, or didn't use the evidence you had. In other words, if you knew more about reality, there wouldn't be accidents. Mm-hmm. But if you believe one thing and reality is something else, that invites at least it doesn't always result in an accident, but every accident is a result of the clash between faith and science. You can take any example you want. Some things that are called accidents are maybe not an accident, like use the example of a meteorite coming down through your automobile or house or something. You couldn't anticipate that, or you couldn't know it ahead of time, so that the insurance companies call that an act of God. But an accident is something that could have been prevented if you
had fuller knowledge.
If you had fuller knowledge, or used the knowledge that you did have. If you ignore knowledge, you can. For instance, if you have knowledge that you're on an icy road and you're going to go around a curve, and nobody has ever made it at 80 miles an hour, and you still do it, you can even know of it, but not really use it. That could result in an accident.
You give a few of those examples in your book, and you kind of conclude that those chunks of paragraphs by saying that therefore science is a better way of accumulating information and for basing your decision making in the world than faith.
Oh, absolutely, and in fact, I often use the examples to back that up by saying when you a youngster, when you were young and you learned how to put your shoes on the right foot at the right time, you were supposed to learn already then that science is better than faith. Faith would be grabbing a shoe and just putting it on whatever foot you feel like at the time. I think it goes on this foot, so I'll try putting it on. I have faith that it's going to go on this foot, and I try it and find out, no, it doesn't go on that foot. Sometimes you might get lucky and it'll go on and you don't think anything of it, but another time you find it doesn't. So pretty soon you discover that you have to look at the shoe and rationally figure out which foot it goes on. That's science. So that's better than just guessing. Or driving your car across the railroad tracks. You're cautioned to look both ways. You could take the approach as you're driving, I believe there's no train coming, so I'm just going to keep on going. I don't have to look. I know there's no train coming. On the other hand, and that's faith. On the other hand, if you look both ways to see if there's a train coming, that's science, getting the evidence. So yeah, science is definitely way better than faith.
Yeah. I feel like that kind of dovetails into your discussion about morality in the book, where you say that it's bottom up instead of top down, which at first blush, I might not understand what that means. I mean, I read the book, so I do, but why don't you tell us, for the viewers, what you mean by that?
The religious people, or the people that take religion seriously, believe that their God, through their pope or bishop or ministers give us the word of how we should, what morality should be, how we should behave, what should we do to live a good life, to reach the next life, so to speak. I claim, and I'm not alone, but morality is actually bottom up. Do unto others as they would do unto you is older than any religion, in fact, that we know of right now. But I'm trying to think of a good example. Could you help me out again with the...
I don't remember the examples in the book. I'm sorry. I mean about it being bottom up rather than top down.
The bottom up,
Yeah.
that's right. That's
No,
what I lost for a second. The bottom up. Minnesota had a good example a few years ago. Do you remember the gay marriage thing?
The proposed amendment for
The proposed
Minnesota
constitutional
Constitution,
amendment. We wanted to permit gay marriages. The Catholic Church spent two-thirds of $1,000,000, I believe, to fight that. They were sending DVDs to all the Catholics.
yeah,
They were
yeah, I
really
remember
spending a lot of money to fight that. And basically, they were getting the direction from the hierarchy.
Right, yeah.
The official Catholic Church position was, we can't allow gay marriages. The people, on the other hand, decided, and in fact voted in favor of allowing gay marriages. So instead of the bishops telling the people what to believe, in that morality example, the people told the bishop what they're going to believe.
A grassroots push.
And prohibition would be another example. The churches pushed prohibition, and finally the government decided that, no, the people don't really believe that. So then they got rid of prohibition again. Another example I like to show that really proves it, when churches split, typically the people in the church, the membership, are the ones that split.
That drive that, yeah.
The hierarchy, the ministers and the bishops never think it's a good idea
Yeah,
to
they're
split.
happy with it the way it is.
Yeah. In fact, the gay marriage, a lot of churches are splitting over that. So you've got one group here that believes one thing and another group here that believes what they want, but now they've split. And so the people are telling the church what to believe rather than the church telling the people. And you can go right down to what they call the blue laws, not working on Sundays. Churches pushed that to try to preserve their Sundays.
Yeah.
But the people finally
Yeah, no, that's repealed too now.
repealed that too. So it's pretty much, if you look in detail at all the moral issues that we're fighting about, the people decide and the churches follow.
So when your book's talking about bottom-up morality and it's really pro-science, how come we have a book that's titled Faith Enterprise? What's the meaning behind that book, behind that title?
I look at it, Faith Enterprise is, churches are an enterprise pushing faith, selling faith, built on faith, in the same way that a lemonade stand is an enterprise selling lemonade, pushing lemonade. Churches push faith. If you took that away, they wouldn't have anything anymore. So in another chapter, I'm talking about baseball, comparing the enterprise, the baseball enterprise and the Catholic Church enterprise, and one is built on faith and one isn't, but there's a lot of parallels between the two. So basically, I think of religions as enterprises.
It's another form of a business, basically.
Another form of business, and they're mainly concerned with their own preservation. The Catholic Church, this is the theme for this year, is evangelism. And the Baptists, just in a convention the last couple of days ago, we're reading about it now in the paper, their main theme is to push evangelism. Just to expand their own
to recruit,
self-interest, to recruit, to build their own numbers. Their churches want to expand their own existence in the same way that an animal species wants to continue living and expanding their own existence.
I don't know if we'll have time to discuss it, but when I first got a copy of your book and I looked at the cover. There's this complex molecule on the cover, and inside one of the atoms is a baseball, which is a clever cover. But at the moment, I just kind of scratched my head and I thought, well, I guess that mystery will be revealed to me as I read the book. So we could, if we have time, we'll talk more about how you compare the Catholic Church to baseball. But first, what I wanted to talk about is you mentioned Noah's Ark before and like the gathering of the animals, but you also talked about the Adam and Eve story, which is basis not only for Catholic theology, but for a lot of the Protestant religions and even for Islam and Judaism. So how do you argue in the book that God's role in the Adam and Eve story is a problem?
I'm going to mention two things.
Okay.
One is real simple, and I'm not going to get into detail on it.
Okay, yeah.
We know already the story about evolution and how humans came about. You can't start a species of anything, even if it's a pair of farm animals, with just one pair. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's a population thing. A population involves. You don't get an individual evolving into existence. But the big thing that I thought of already way back in high school days already was the idea that if you're looking at the Adam and Eve story, a lot of miracles had to happen, and I'm assuming you're familiar with the story, what it was all about. Every Christian, like you said, a lot of religions are familiar with it. A lot of miracles had to occur to make that story even somewhat plausible, okay? And just to give a couple examples, this serpent that spoke to Adam or Eve to seduce him into eating the apple, that had to be a miracle at that point. Also, God had, since these were the first people according to the Adam and Eve story, God had to totally be responsible for educating them and infusing them with the knowledge they needed to survive. What to do and what not to do, how to live, basically how to survive. And that had to be a miracle, okay? God didn't set up a classroom and take 12 years of education like we typically educate a kid now.
Or they didn't even have parents.
They didn't. That's right. They didn't have any parents. It was God. God was responsible for educating those people. So it had to be a miracle. So I say, an analogy, if you stand and hold the door and drive the getaway car for a bank robbery, something that we all admit is a bad deal.
Yes, being complicit.
Okay?
Yeah.
If you're complicit, you help make this event happen, this bad thing happen, you end up going to jail too.
Yeah.
Does that seem
That's
reasonable?
a fair, yeah.
If you held the door and you drove the car to make this bank robbery work, you're guilty of something and you go to jail too. You contributed to it. Well, these miracles that had to happen in the Garden of Eve to make that story plausible, to even allow them to function and make a decision and even think about eating that apple or even being aware that they shouldn't eat it, or even God speaking to them. This is all miracles. So literally God was in the middle of doing miracles to make this bad event that all civilization supposedly is suffering for now. God had to do miracles to make that happen. It's like holding the door.
Yeah, so he's complicit in their crime, yeah.
Yeah. So it was something bad that happened, and supposedly, according to the Christians, we're suffering for it yet today. But God had to do some miracles to even help make that happen. And he's supposed to be omnibenevolent.
Yeah.
So explain that to me.
So there's really like piles of apologies and miracles that have to take place just in the first few pages of the Bible, you're saying, in order to let us swallow the rest of it.
Yes, but it's making something bad happen. If it were miracles to make something good happen, like just the creation, okay, that I don't see any contradiction yet in that. If you want to tell me that God created...
Right, at least he doesn't sound like a bad guy yet.
It doesn't sound like a bad guy yet, that's right. But if he's now starting to do things that make him sound like a bad guy, that's a good expression. Then I question the whole story. Then you start losing me on it.
So later, there are Christians who will say that a lot of that is analogy or whatever, but later in the Bible comes the New Testament, and most of your, obviously with your Catholic background, most of your book is probably appealing to Catholics or trying to kind of pick their brain a little bit or picking on their dogma somewhat, but later when you talk about the New Testament, you also talk about how the Catholics have one belief or doctrine as to when it was written, but you take issue with that. You want to talk about that for a couple minutes?
Sure. When you're coming out of Catholic school, you think that the apostles that were living with Jesus wrote down what all happened at that time and passed it on to us, and that has become the New Testament. The reality is, if you read even Catholic literature, the Bible was put together in 325 AD.
About 300 years after Jesus.
3 centuries after this supposedly Jesus lived on earth. So, and just to give you just a little history on it, if we got time, Constantine, the Roman emperor at the time, was sensing that these religious people that were Christians scattered around that part of the world had their bishops at that point, and they were kind of diverging, and he was worried that if they got too influential and diverged too much, his empire would split. So he called a council, the Council of Nicaea. The first Catholic council, in fact, was called by a Roman emperor, not a pope or bishop or anything else. He called them together to get their story straight, to get a common gospel, a common belief. Let's put this all together and make one faith out of it, rather than a bunch of religions that are tearing the empire apart. And as a result of that, in fact, another thing they settled at the Council of Nicaea was whether Jesus really was a God. There was a big debate going on, and you know it had to be a big debate if it was formally discussed and decided and published at the Council of Nicaea.
Because if they were all in agreement, they wouldn't have bothered bringing it up.
If they were all in agreement, if it was obvious to everybody that we had this guy wandering the earth doing miracles and all this. But 300 years afterwards, they only decided that, that was God. He was God. And so they had plenty of time to pass up their stories and make up stories and change stories, but it all came together into the New Testament in 325.
Another aspect about Catholic theology that I found kind of enlightening to me that I didn't really think about before, because I come from a Protestant background where they kind of eschew a lot of the traditions and the pomp that Catholics seem to like. But you talk about how at some point tradition became as important or almost as important as the Bible itself.
It turns out that by the time you got into close to the 15th century, after the printing press came out, and a number of people printed gospels in their own languages, the vernaculars, the church, I think, felt threatened. So it became obvious that there were lots of contradictions in the Bible. This Bible that this Council of Nicaea came up with was just full of contradictions, and I spent a whole chapter pointing some of them out, but the Catholic Church didn't want people to find out about those, to read about them. They even forbade people to own a Bible, or they could get their house burned down in the 1500s. So in about 1556, roughly, Council of Trent, the Catholic Church decided that since they couldn't count only on the Bible to buttress their structure of their dogma, they decided that tradition was going to be just as legitimate, equally legitimate as the Bible.
Okay, yeah.
Council of Trent, 1500s.
So we just have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to talk about, you bring it up to, after following this whole history, you bring it up to today. Here we are in the United States, and despite the fact that religions often try to meddle in governmental affairs, like we talked about earlier with that proposed constitutional amendment, religions, even the Catholic Church, enjoy certain privileges, and they get certain benefits from the government. You want to take a minute or two to just mention?
Oh, sure. I can just take a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
The one is religions don't have to register as a foreign what do they call somebody that's trying to influence our government? What do they call them? And they're all over the Senate and the House trying to influence the congressman.
Lobbyists?
Lobbyists.
Yeah,
Religions don't have to register as lobbyists. And so the Catholic Church, being an official state, in fact, they're literally official state.
Yeah, the Vatican, yeah.
The Vatican can do all the lobbying they want without registering. And then also the Christians in general get things like "In God We Trust" on the coins, holidays, national prayer days, or 10 Commandments on courthouse lawns, things like that. So there's a lot of things the government does to help promote religions.
So if we want to find out more about that, we can read your book, which I recommend to people. We're running out of time here, but I wanted to talk to you about the 3 types of prayer. Richard in his book mentions that there's 3 different kinds of prayer, which I thought was really interesting. I don't think we have time to discuss that. And then there's a whole chapter that's probably the most lighthearted one near the end. It is the last chapter where you talk about the similarities between baseball and the Catholic Church, which I got a kick out of, but it's also really enlightening. But one thing that I did want to mention is your book touches on evolution and the facts of it and why it's the way of the world that we should accept, but obviously you don't go into too great a detail in your book. But did you have a book to recommend to people if they wanted to learn more about evolution?
One of them I happened to bring along, "Why Evolution is True." Very excellent book explaining evolution if you want to study it from how scientists understand it. And Richard Dawkins has a nice book, The Greatest Story Ever Told, basically the story about evolution. And he's an evolutionary scientist, and he does a nice job of explaining it also.
So 2 endorsements from someone who has a science degree and taught science for years.
I'm a believer.
Yeah, so Jerry Coyne's Why Evolution is True and Richard Dawkins' The Greatest Show on Earth.
The Greatest Story Ever Told, I think.
Okay. All right, well, it's Richard Dawkins, whatever, people
Yes.
look it up. Okay, so if you want to read Richard's book again, by the way, it's Faith Enterprise, Making Mysteries and Miracles Vanish. Especially read the part about baseball.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for your time and for talking with us. We're out of time, but there's a lot more to read if you want to find out more about Richard's story and about, especially if you come from a Catholic background, I think it would really be appealing to people who are skeptical of some of their theology. But if you enjoy our show and want to find out more, please contact us at the contact information that you'll see on screen. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you, we'll be happy to go ahead and send you a copy of our newsletter. Thank you.